So this is our cleanup hitter spot where we bring.
Speaking about disruption,
the ultimate disruptive thinker and pioneer to follow our two extraordinary guests that we had. So we have Dr. Janice Presser, founder and chief technology officer of Teamability.com. Dr. Janice, which is how we affectionately refer to Dr. Presser, Dr. Janice has owned her own blog. You can learn more about her on drjanicepresser.com, has been telling stories and, more importantly, helping people tell their stories for the last 30 years. So she started when she was 5. In 2001, Dr. Janice began development of Teamability, this first technology to describe and predict how people work together. So it's currently being used in organizations from global Fortune 1000 to startups to design teams, select and develop employees, and improve the culture. This is the key word, the culture. Because we keep talking about technology, people, process, but ultimately the number one success factor is culture of operation and business environments. So you can follow Dr. Janice on Twitter to learn about her wisdom at DRJNICE. Welcome back, Dr. Janice, to DisrupTV.
Hey, so we're just disrupting everybody. What two great speakers. I love DisrupTV. I always come away with something that I am doing, but it's the explanation for it. So now I know why I ordered that makeup and not the other one.
Well, hey, look, happy to have you, Dr. Janice.
Shout out. Yeah. Get it at Sephora.
Well, we got a lot of topics we want to cover here, and I think there's some cool stuff here. Let's start simple. Let's talk about the podcast revolution and your role in it, because I see you everywhere talking podcasts, talking, going to these conferences around podcasts. Like, what's happening with podcasts? And we're on a podcast, by the way. But anyway.
Well, this is a typical adventure I've had in my life. It's like I've walked through the door that has no sign on it. And I found myself in the middle of this podcast thing. So the history, I actually have a podcast history, sort of. I was on one of the first internet radio shows. This is a zillion years ago. I think it might have been 2002 or 3, but I'm not sure. And the person who had me on said, when he was trying to get me to go on, he said, listen, I said, you have an audience for this? Who listens to the radio on the internet? He said, yes. He said, I have 3 people, and one of them is my mother, and she will call in and ask you a question. I mean, what was I going to say? No? I'm not going to say no to somebody's mother. So, being a mother and everything I know, I learned from my kids. So I got into this whole world, and I've resisted doing my own podcast. And Ray and Val, you've been part of that because you just invite me on. So I get to have the fun, and I don't have to go find my own Oprah to actually make this happen. She's pretty amazing, right? So I actually did walk through one of those doors, and I became a speaker at Podcast Movement, which is this huge convention. Now, I was there at the invitation of Westwood One, which is a big terrestrial radio station. I suspect I got invited because they needed a woman to speak on this, very all-male panel. If you're in technology, it's not a challenge at all. And so I got to go to the convention, and I was interested in one thing. Are any of you people making money? And I had discrete ways to ask that. I can be semi-filtered. Most of the time I'm completely unfiltered, which is why I love to hang out with you guys. And so I asked, and I found that really not only is nobody making money at this, but nobody knows what is the business model that's going to work. So I'm sure that some of you read about the giant sale to Spotify of a couple of large podcast technology platforms, Gimlet and Anchor, big ones. They spend a ridiculous amount of money, and I don't know if you've even ever heard of either of them. But here's the non-disruption about podcasting. They call it podcasting. You know, like the iPod that you had before your iPhone replaced it.
Yeah, right.
It replaced. You remember? I mean, Ray does a great rap on everything that your phone has replaced. Right? It's replaced everything but your Swiss Army knife, and I'm sure they're going to figure out how to do that. Right? So I don't know. If you want to disrupt the industry, you better come up with a more innovative name first, or else, you know, manufacture retro iPods that might make.
Well, it's crazy, right? I mean, the names are like Relay FM, something else FM. I mean, it's like all retro. So you get a great point there on the podcast piece. So,
okay. So here's what I think is going on, because I am so after I did this, I was on this panel with some very interesting people. Actually, the guy that Howard Stern reported to or did his show. Opie of Opie and Anthony, formerly of a couple of places until they got a little too bad boy, I understand. So I was more convinced than ever that actually podcasting myself probably was a bad idea because of what makes a really good podcast and what's going to actually make a difference. And this is what I think it is. I think really the future is going to have to be interactive, like teaming. You know, we want to do things together. And the only thing that podcasting does now that brings you together is you recommend a podcast to a friend. And then maybe you might discuss it. But there is no way to actually be part of a podcast asynchronously. That is, unless you're here now and you tweet, if you tweet a question or you put a question up on the box, then we don't know that you're asking that question. And after this is done, it's done. So I think that's going to be something future because everything interactive it's all about the experience. Here's another thing, right? So I have a niche in this, a niche interest, because one of my, shall I call it spare time hobbies or my fun things to do is I've become a videographer. So I'm actually videographing somebody else's fabulous YouTube series because it's a way to make interaction part of it. It's very interactive with customers. And it's about rock and roll. You know, when you asked me what I wanted to speak about, I said, you know, Internet of Things, the future of work, and, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Maybe not drugs in that way, but, you know, kind of the new wave of technology, new drug technologies that are replacing kind of the old hashtag SDRR. You guys use that one, don't you? Okay.
No.
Okay.
We'll come clean. No.
We're just,
okay.
We're just high on knowledge.
You don't have to do it. But there's something exciting going on in the rock space. So, you know, it's you know that the Rolling Stones are older than me. And I'm older.
Yeah.
And they're still touring. Yes, I am going to see them. So excited. There is a longing, a consumer nostalgia, you know, and it's not only the boomers, because if we raised our kids right, we raised them loving the Beatles, the Stones, etc., and, you know, Eric Johnson, if you're in my camp. And that's driving legacy marketing, because all these old guys, and they're almost all guys, let's just say the Rolling Stones, Beatles, all guys, they are trying to market their legacy, and they're tapping into consumer nostalgia. And it's one is feeding the other, and feeding the other. And I suspect that those kind of powerful interactions between the producer and the consumer are going to be what drives the next level of, let's not even call it podcasting, because you know what a podcast is? A podcast is when you can't look and you can only listen. That's what you do, right? Most podcasts are consumed in the 20-minute interval between work and home. or vice versa. So when you can have the opportunity to actually see what's going on, and we're a little low tech here because you're just seeing faces, but when you're talking about a subject that benefits from seeing things, it's much more engaging, right? So I think that's the future is going to be the video to audio, kind of like you're doing. I mean, no one would ever accuse Vala and Ray about being, 10 miles behind the curve. They're always out there pushing the bleeding edge. So that's where it's going. And
there's a lot in terms of accelerants when we talk about podcast. One, you're not going to see smart speakers without screens. So you have now this notion of ambient computing at home and at work, conversational environment coupled with screens. So you can have podcasts coupled with visuals in terms of how you entertain yourself. We just had a guest who interviewed Elon Musk, and he said we're feature complete for full autonomy, level 4, level 5. Now, through regulation and testing, it'll be maybe 2-3 years. But now you're going to be in your car, in your taxi, in your Uber, and you'll have the ability to listen to and watch because you are in an autonomous vehicle. So you have the ability to safely consume content. Now, Wall Street Journal published very recently that Spotify and Pandora are using artificial intelligence to discover the podcast matching your persona. And that matching is so well that in 2018, we passed $400 million in digital advertising on podcasts. That was almost a 90% growth in digital ads from 2017. So as machine learning offer you podcasts based on the company you work, the sector you serve, what you share on social media, you're going to find yourself more and more as consumers of podcasts. Today, there's almost 18 million unique users on NPR's podcast. There's 18 million unique monthly users. New York Times has got about 10 million unique monthly users. Ray and I have been approached numerous times to have advertising on Disrupt, and we chose to have our autonomy and not have advertisers dictate who we bring on the show and the content we cover. But after 350 unique guests, 3 years, and having guests like yourself, high caliber guests, I'm certain we could have logos pepper sprayed on DisrupTV if you wanted to. And at some point, maybe the pressure is too much to resist. But my point is digital ad on podcast space has a growth curve that looks like this. And machine learning will make it such that people are going to gravitate more and more to consuming content on transit, because this mobile-only world that we live, whether you're on a bus or a train or a hotel or whatever, every minute that you can consume content to be smarter, faster, more informed, that's how you're going to compete in the post-digital era. So I'm super bullish on podcasts because of smart screen, smart speakers at home, because of AI-powered suggestions, and the fact that we kind of live in a completely mobile world now. So you really don't have the notion of going in a classroom or sitting behind a desk in order to consume. So sorry, those are my 2 cents on podcasts.
that was a good $2, maybe €2. But so here's what I'm struggling with. I'm struggling with the supply side of this. And so what motivates someone to start a podcast in an environment where the odds of somebody listening to it may be extremely small because there are so many? And is this in fact going the way of books? So, if you do the next Harry Potter book, you will sell a huge number. The old numbers, when I wrote my first book, they said, well, if you sell 4,000, or maybe it was 3,800, we break even and we consider it a win. That book sold 100,000, and then they lost the plates to it. But that's
wow.
My answer to that is
publisher near
whether you're a business or an individual like us three. If you consider yourself an educator, over time you consider what you do in terms of sharing content as an obligation. Yes. So Ray and I started this as like a fun Friday thing to do, but today Ray and I view DisrupTV as an obligation for us, because if people are going to call us influencers, trailblazers, thought leaders, whatever label you want to throw at us, both of us think we're just helping, but it becomes an obligation. So companies that recognize the digital divide that exists with the haves and the have-nots. If a company wants to succeed in the fourth industrial revolution, it's your obligation to create content and deliver that in the preference of your stakeholders, employees, customers, partners, communities. So if you're a company and you're not purposefully creating and distributing content on how to improve the society and business outcomes and overall experience of your stakeholders, I don't think you're going to be able to survive and grow in this world. So I view this as more of an obligation, not, you know, something that's nice to have. Ray, your points of view.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say the big shift that's happened is, you know, individuals and personalities. We've gone from being brands, delivering on a brand promise, but the next level up is really about movements, right? And from moving from a brand promise to a movement is really where podcasts are one piece of it, right? It's a medium that actually gets you to the next level. And the question is, what's your movement about, right? For some, it might be tech for good. For other people, it might be, you know, global climate change. For other people, it might be, you know, preserving a certain set of cultures and values, right? But the point being is, these are all mediums to actually deliver on movements. And I see that actually working hand in hand. I'm not sure where podcasts are going to go in terms of the listeners, but I do know that, you know, we're all building movements, and that's where brands eventually are going to head.
One of the big things that we know about teams is that you need the people who come up with the big ideas and then push them into strategic reality. But if you don't have the on the ground people doing the action, then that's tough. And their motivation is about doing things together. And that's why what's fascinated me is that at the same time I've seen the podcast move into kind of this nostalgia area, there's also an enormous drive on people, coming from people, to come together and co-experience something. Like, you know, someone was telling me about a wonderful experience in a bar, but sitting around, it was like a vinyl bar where they're playing old music and everyone's talking about, oh my God, I was at that concert. And somebody else saying, so was I. Yeah. And it's a, you know, common experience drives community building, and it drives an all positive culture. And I just don't feel right skipping over the fact that we're living in a horribly culture divide, politically speaking, not only in the US, but it seems to be just in waves all over. And what does, so, you know, my final thought is that what doesn't bring us together will probably drive us apart. And so, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The intention was always hashtag at Dr. Janice, DrJanice.
We are live here with Dr. Janice, founder and CTO of Teamability. We use Teamability here at Constellation Research. You can follow her at Twitter at Dr. Janice. Get a little bit more of what's happening, not only in podcasts, but in SDRR. All right. Hey, thanks a lot for being on the show. Happy Friday. So this is episode 40 on DisrupTV.